Hello and welcome to episode 24 of Unpacking Articles. The article we're going to unpack today is called The What's, Why's, How's, and Who's of Content-Based Instruction in Second/Foreign Language Education. And this article provides a nice overview of what content-based instruction is and is not. And you could say CBI is essentially an umbrella term within the bigger umbrella of communicative language teaching. And many people, in fact, describe it as a spin-off of CLT. But that's also true for task-based, comprehension-based, many different spin-offs. What makes content-based instruction different from these approaches is that content topics guide the curriculum, not the language itself, not communicative functions or situations. In many of these other approaches, developing communicative ability is the goal itself. But within CBI, content-based instruction, learning the content is the main goal. Now, we need to clarify a myth or a misconception associated with CBI that stems from what I just said. Saying that language itself is not the primary goal doesn't mean that there is no focus on form, that there's no focus on language. The author makes it a point to say that content and form is not a dichotomy, but rather they are integrated. And this content-form integration implies explicit focus on relevant and contextually appropriate language forms to support content learning activities in the classroom. You can indeed have explicit focus on form as long as it is relevant and contextually appropriate for your content learning goals. The article discusses several reasons why CBI is particularly effective. If learners are engaging with content, understanding content, expressing ideas related to content, and it's something that they want to learn about, is a topic that they're very interested in, well, jackpot, that is wonderful for language acquisition, for language development. So what is CBI? How do we make it happen in the classroom? There are strong and weak versions of CBI. The strong form would be something like discipline-specific courses. For example, a geography course in the target language. A weak form of CBI is sometimes called content-enriched instruction. The content is there to enhance or support language learning, but language learning is still one of the main priorities. Now, in between the strong and weak, there are many different shades of CBI. The author discusses this continuum, which was proposed by someone else, Med, in 1999. And in this continuum, we have one extreme of content-driven and the other extreme of language-driven. An example of content-driven courses, the strongest form of CBI, would be immersion programs. So the students, for example, are taking a science class in the target language. Their goal is not primarily or exclusively to develop communicative ability in the language, but rather the goals of the course are things like to learn about photosynthesis. Then in the other extreme, we have language-driven courses, and this is where we have content for language practice. The goal of the course is to develop communicative ability in the target language. And you might have goals such as describing where we live, describing our daily routine. And in those courses, the students might watch a video that teaches them about a cultural aspect, for example, but is not considered content-based instruction. Where do we draw the line? Well, you could say that the limit between counts as CBI, doesn't count as CBI, is where theme-based courses are. Theme-based courses are essentially the most prevalent, the most common compromise between content-driven and language-driven. And the author describes theme-based courses as a sequence of topics linked together by the assumption of a coherent overall theme. And they're considered the weakest version of CBI. So what are some fundamental aspects of all versions of CBI? The author mentions these aspects: subject matter, the content, obviously, authenticity, and needs. So let's go one by one. What counts as content? That is a big question. It could certainly be discipline specific, geography, math, science, etc. But not necessarily. It could be thematically related, but it's not specific to just one discipline. And the author gives an example of a course that is about one particular country where the target language is spoken, and the thematic units target different aspects: the language, the geography, the history, current events, etc. So it is not specific to one discipline, but it is all about content. The primary purpose is to learn about this country. And I found it interesting that the author describes content as something that provides engaging information. That makes me think, how do we define engaging information? What about language itself? If my students love linguistics and grammar, and I just talk about grammar all day in the target language, does that count as content? What about language for the purpose of entertainment? If we ask a student to read a short story, to watch a funny video, does that count as content? If the purpose of this information, the purpose of this content is really about developing communicative ability, or it's just about acquiring the language, then we have crossed over into language driven and not so much content driven. Are we engaging with this content and information for the sake of learning information? Or are we engaging with this content for the real purpose of developing communicative ability in the language? And I know that sometimes it's not easy to separate these two purposes, but you have to go back to what is the primary purpose. Another essential component of content-based instruction that the author discusses is that the text, the materials, have to be primarily, though not exclusively, authentic. And how do we define authentic? Well, this is the red flag for me. The author of this particular article says that it is something produced for native speakers. But I think it's problematic to associate authenticity with native speakers. We can probably unpack authenticity in another video. And the third essential element of CBI is that the topics and tasks and everything about the course should be selected with cognitive and affective needs in mind. It needs to be appropriate to their proficiency level, their age, their interests, their goals. And of course, this makes perfect sense, but in practical terms, this brings up some challenges. What do we do when we have novice level students who have different needs, different interests, different goals? And the other question has to do with the expertise of the instructor. Does the instructor need to have expertise in both language pedagogy as well as the content? So the takeaway is what CBI brings to the table, and that is to make connections through the language to other disciplines. I feel like in many of the spin-offs of communicative language teaching, our focus remains very much on the language. What can they do with the language? But CBI is about making new connections that go beyond the language itself. That's just my take on it. As usual, I encourage you to read the original and draw your own conclusions. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.